Please, Amelia, don't deny this.
I cannot, Julian. It is too late.
Welcome back to part 2 of The Widow and the War Hero. In the first half, our widow, Amelia, and our tormented soldier, Julian, found solace in shared grief. Now, their connection must face its greatest enemy, the guilt that separates the living from the dead. Julian decides to leave Whitby, believing his presence only brings Amelia pain. But before he goes, they will share one last agonizing encounter by the sea, a moment where a kiss is denied and all seems lost. The hardest truth is yet to come. The question is, will Amelia let him walk away with the secret that haunts his soul? Part 4, the guilt that follows. The shared shelter under the pavilion marked an unspoken turning point. In the weeks that followed, the fragile tendrils of their bond deepened with a quiet, startling swiftness. Julian's convalescence kept him near Whitby, and Amelia, finding her solitary walks suddenly less appealing, often found herself coinciding with his own cautious strolls along the quieter lanes. Their correspondence became a daily staple. Julian, a man of few words in person, proved to be an expressive writer. His letters, delivered by a discreet messenger, were not love tokens, but rather quiet essays on his observations of the sea, the absurdity of country society, and most potently, his guarded thoughts on the nature of duty and survival. Amelia's replies were equally circumspect, offering small, charming glimpses into her past life with Thomas, the comfort of the hearth, the challenges of a doctor's wife, and, carefully, her growing appreciation for the beauty of the present moment. Their small moments of laughter, a shared joke about a particularly pompous local magistrate, a dry observation on the weather, were treasures to Amelia. They were fleeting, bright sounds that chased the fog from her memory and left her breathless with a strange, exhilarating happiness. Yet happiness was precisely the source of her renewed anguish. The more Julian's presence offered her light, the longer and darker the shadow of her guilt became. Every smile she offered, Julian felt like a betrayal to her late husband's memory. Thomas had been so good, so unconditionally loving. To entertain the thought of replacing him, or worse, of outgrowing the depth of her grief, felt like a profound moral failing. She would stand before the small, painted miniature of Thomas, her late husband's kind eyes seeming to hold a mild reproach. "I promised, Thomas. I promised never to give this heart away again." Amelia began to retreat. Her replies to Julian became shorter, more formal. She invented excuses to cancel their planned walks, claiming urgent needlework or a sudden headache. Her former composure returned, but this time it was brittle and forced, a desperate attempt to stuff the awakened emotions back into their cage. Julian, a man acutely attuned to unspoken pain, sensed her withdrawal instantly. He understood the language of retreat. He had spoken it himself for years. He knew the precise measure of fear that drove a person to abandon peace for the familiar safety of suffering. He did not push. He did not accuse. He knew the fight she was having was internal, and to press her would only drive her further away. Yet, he also knew he could not stay and watch her extinguish her own light out of misplaced fidelity. He loved her too much to be the source of her torment. If their quiet bond was what caused her pain, he would remove it. One bleak late afternoon, Julian called at her cottage. He found her in her parlor, the light too dim, her needle poised over a dull gray fabric. His eyes, though weary, were resolutely determined. "Mrs. Harcourt," he said, standing tall in the small room, "I have settled my affairs. Colonel Avery requires my assistance on his estates further north. I shall be departing Whitby tomorrow, before dawn." The announcement struck Amelia with the physical force of a blow, stealing the air from her lungs. She looked up, her expression a mask of shocked pain that she immediately attempted to cover. "That is sudden, Captain. I wish you well." Her voice was tight, her composure failing her utterly. "It is necessary," Julian stated simply. "I cannot stay and permit scandal or further discomfort to follow you." He knew the discomfort was guilt, and the scandal was merely the fear of it. Amelia's eyes glistened. She knew he was leaving for her sake, giving her the space to return to her safe numbness. But the thought of his complete absence, of the return to the cold, beige world, terrified her. "I am sorry," she whispered, not sure if she was apologizing for her withdrawal or for his necessary departure. He looked at her with an intensity that burned through the air between them. "Meet me, Amelia, one last time, by the cove where we met. Tonight, at the high tide." She hesitated only a moment. She knew the danger, but the need to see him, to understand, was overwhelming. "I will be there." That evening, the air was sharp with salt and the roar of the tide. Amelia found Julian standing exactly where she had first seen him, leaning against the cold stone of the cliff face. She walked towards him, the sound of her heavy cloak and their ragged breathing swallowed by the noise of the ocean. "You should not have come out in this cold. Captain," she murmured, shivering, "I would not have left without seeing you again." Julian turned, and the stoic mask he usually wore had finally cracked. He looked profoundly exhausted and utterly honest. "I should have died there, Amelia," he whispered, his voice catching on the admission that haunted him daily. "On the field. I deserved to." Amelia stepped closer, her eyes shining with unshed tears. The pain of her own long-held feeling of unworthiness flowed into her reply. "And I did," she answered softly, her hand reaching out but not quite touching him, just in a different way. The air thrummed with their mutual confession, two souls who believed they had forfeited the right to happiness. Julian closed the final distance between them. He raised his hand, his trembling now fierce, and gently brushed a stray tear from her cheek. His gaze dropped to her mouth, his intent clear, his heart laid bare. Their lips were only a breath apart. She could feel the desperate warmth of him, the promise of shelter and life. This was the moment of decision, retreat into the cold safety of her widowhood, or step into the unknown fire of life. The ingrained guilt won. With a heart-wrenching sob, Amelia pulled violently away, stepping back into the shadow of the cliff. Tears falling with the tide, she shook her head, unable to speak the word no, yet acting upon it with devastating finality. Julian's hand dropped, his face registering the pain of a man receiving a mortal wound he had long anticipated. He did not try to follow. He merely watched her turn and flee back up the cliff path, disappearing into the fog and the relentless rain, leaving him standing alone with the sound of his own solitary regret. Part 5. The Letter He Left Behind. True to his word, Captain Julian Lennox departed before dawn. He left the coast of Whitby with the cold resignation of a man who knows his fate and accepts the loneliness it entails. He did not look back at the rising sun. He was accustomed to walking towards the dark. Amelia, sleepless and ravaged by the night's tormented choices, woke to the heavy silence of the morning. The feeling of Julian's presence, the brief, agonizing closeness of his lips, still lingered in the frigid air of her parlor. She had chosen safety, the cold safety of her promise, over the terrifying warmth of life, and the victory tasted like ash. Later that morning, a small square envelope, sealed with the military precision Julian favored, was delivered by Colonel Avery's stable boy. It was addressed simply to Mrs. Harcourt. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. She knew instantly it was his final word, and she opened it with a desperate fear that he had simply said goodbye. Instead, she found what felt like the core of the man himself, a confession. Julian's handwriting was firm, yet the words bled with the secret he had carried like a debilitating wound. "Amelia, I leave you this, not as a final plea, but as an act of honesty I have denied myself and others for 3 years. You believe me a hero, a wounded soldier, and I have allowed you to believe a lie. You spoke of my courage, but the truth is I left the service branded a coward, or rather a man whose judgment was deemed insubordinate. During the final push at Badajoz, I was given an order to take a strategic hill. The victory would have been certain, but the cost would have been the lives of 300 men, men cornered in a defile awaiting reinforcement. I refused. The order was suicidal. I argued, I stalled, and I managed to divert them through a safer route, saving every one of them. But I disobeyed a direct command in the face of the enemy. The commanding officer, a celebrated brute, covered the refusal by reporting me wounded and declaring the retreat a moment of misjudgment under fire. I was quietly shipped home, decorated for my injuries, and offered an easy discharge. My heroism is a lie built on the bodies I refused to bury. I saved lives, but in the eyes of the army I showed fear for my own men. They were right. And that shame, that truth, is why I told you I deserve to die. The guilt I carry is not for those I lost, but for those I saved, for which I must now live a lie. I believed myself unworthy of love or happiness, Amelia, and most certainly of your pure kindness. Last night, you chose your sacred promise, and I understand. But please believe me when I say this. If my fractured soul has known peace again, if I have recalled what it is to laugh or to feel the steadying touch of a gentle hand, it is because of you. Do not mourn the man who leaves. Mourn only the one who arrived, cold and dead to the world. Julian. The letter dropped from Amelia's suddenly nerveless fingers onto the carpet. She did not hear it fall. The world around her seemed to have tilted on its axis, and the silence in her sitting room was no longer the silence of apathy, but the ringing clarity of truth. She had thought Julian's conflict was simple survivor's guilt. It was instead the exquisite silent agony of a man who had chosen humanity over honor, compassion over military glory, and had been condemned for it. He was not an accidental hero. He was a silent, deliberate one. He had forfeited his reputation to save lives. And in his confession, Amelia saw the profound, blinding reality of her own mistake. Her loyalty to Thomas had been rooted in the belief that love was finite, a single possession given once and for all. She had believed that loving Julian was a betrayal of the man she had lost. But Julian's letter changed everything. His act of salvation, sacrificing his own peace for the lives of others, was the very definition of the tenderness she had always cherished in Thomas. Love was not a single guarded possession. It was a boundless capacity for empathy and courage. Julian was not asking her to replace Thomas. He was asking her to live in the same spirit of courageous kindness that Thomas embodied. Love was not betrayal. It was healing. A fierce, vital energy rushed through her, a feeling she had not experienced since before the fever took her husband. She had pushed away the one man who understood the language of her sorrow, the one man whose soul was as kind and brave as the one she had lost. She did not allow herself another moment of regret or paralysis. She rose from her seat, grabbing her thickest cloak and tying her bonnet with frantic speed. The train line, the lifeblood of transport out of Whitby, was a good mile's run away. She had no carriage, no time for propriety, and no thought for what anyone in the village might say. Amelia Harcourt was rushing, not to save her life, but to save her soul, determined not to let him disappear into regret. Part 6, The Widow and the War Hero. Amelia arrived at the Whitby train station breathless, her cheeks flushed scarlet from the cold and the frantic exertion. Her heavy cloak was damp and her bonnet askew, but she paid no mind to her appearance. The small enclosed platform was shrouded in a clinging metallic mist, a mix of sea fog and the steam from the arriving engine. The air was deafeningly loud with the hiss of the machinery and the clang of luggage being loaded. She scanned the few figures huddled on the platform, her heart sinking with every empty space. Then she saw him. Julian Lennox stood near the end of the platform, slightly away from the small group of departing passengers. He was just as he had been by the sea, tall, imposing, yet utterly wounded and weary. He wore a travel-stained greatcoat, his hand resting on his cane. He stared down the tracks, not towards the journey ahead, but into the bleakness of the earth beneath his feet, the picture of a man preparing to vanish into a self-imposed exile of regret. There was no time for hesitation, no room for the careful propriety that had shackled her for years. The locomotive whistle gave a sharp, agonizing blast, the signal of imminent departure. Amelia gathered the last of her strength and walked toward him. She did not run. She walked with a resolute, quiet certainty that demanded his attention. Julian heard the crunch of her steps on the gravel, distinct from the noise of the platform. He raised his eyes, and when he saw her, disheveled, desperate, yet more beautiful than he had ever seen her, a wave of painful, overwhelming shock crossed his face. He straightened, dropping his gaze to the letter he knew she must have read. "Amelia," he began, his voice rough, "you should not be here. I have confessed who I am. I am no." She cut him off, reaching him in two final, decisive steps. Without a word of warning, she stepped forward and took his hand, the one not holding the cane, covering it with both of hers. Her skin, cold from the run, was instantly warmed by the desperate heat of his. The profound physical contact, the absolute proof of her presence, seemed to immobilize him, silencing his protestations of unworthiness. She looked up into his tormented dark eyes, her own brimming with the truth she had finally grasped. "Your confession did not reveal a coward, Captain," she said, her voice clear and steady against the steam and the noise. It revealed a man who chose life over glory, a man whose honor lies not in following orders, but in protecting the innocent. She tightened her grip on his hand, her own offering the stability he had needed ever since the pavilion. You asked me to promise you nothing but home, Julian. I cannot give you that, not yet. His face tightened with fresh pain, mistaking her meaning. I cannot promise you peace, Captain, she clarified, a soft, profound smile touching her lips. The shadows of war and grief are long, and they may follow us. I cannot promise you that your ghosts will leave you. The train gave a final loud whistle, and the engine began to move, hissing and churning beside them. But I can promise you home, she declared, her eyes shining with absolute resolve. A place where you will be seen, where you will be heard, and where you will always be cherished for your great and quiet truth. Julian stood trembling, the tears that would not fall on the battlefield now clinging to his lashes. This was more than acceptance. This was a profound absolution. She was not asking him to forget his past, but to share it, and in that sharing to finally begin living. Amelia, he finally whispered, the name catching in his throat. He brought her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her cold skin. And I can promise you life again. As the train slowly pulled away and the dense white steam swirled around them, momentarily isolating them in a private, shimmering world, he did not hesitate. He gently released her hands and gathered her into his arms, drawing her close against the solid warmth of his body. Their lips finally met. It was not a kiss of reckless passion, but a quiet, trembling promise, a breath held for years and finally released. It was a kiss born from shared pain and resurrected hope, a silent, profound understanding that love can bloom even after loss. They stood there for a long moment until the train was gone and the platform was still, the lingering scent of smoke mixing with the fresh tang of the sea. When they finally broke apart, Julian's eyes held a light that had not been there before. The steady, powerful light of a man who has decided, finally, to allow himself happiness. He did not reach for his cane. He reached instead for her hand, intertwining their fingers, the smooth gold of her widow's ring resting against the rough warmth of his palm. Together, the widow and the war hero turned their backs on the empty tracks. They walked out of the station and headed towards the cliffs, walking hand in hand. The fog was lifting, and as they reached the high, wind-swept path, the sun broke through the heavy morning mist, bathing the rugged coastline in a brilliant, clean light. They had faced the darkness of the past. Now they were walking into the quiet strength of their second chance. And so concludes the journey of Amelia and Julian. From the shadows of the past, they found the courage to claim a future, proving that the quiet strength of empathy can mend even the deepest wounds. Theirs is a romance born not of fairy tales, but of fire and truth. Thank you for listening to The Widow and the War Hero. If this story of second chances and quiet intimacy stole your breath, please show your support by liking this video, subscribing for more emotionally rich historical romance, and commenting below to tell us what moment between Amelia and Julian touched your heart the most. We cherish your support, and we look forward to sharing more stories with you soon.